for attending the session last week in which Jim Cusick and Neil Ware introduced us to the overarching concept of cultural landscapes using our nearby Paynes Prairie as one of Florida's best examples of a cultural landscape. When I began my research for this course, I found the framework for looking at landscapes used by our National Park Service to be best suited to this course. And I was surprised that the National Park Service concept of cultural landscape was tracing the concept to the 17th century painters of Claude Lorrain and Nicolas Poussin, French nationals whose painting careers were in Italy, because those of you who were in the course I did a century ago on the garden as history may recall that it was these two artists who were responsible for inspiring Capability Brown and his successor, Sir Humphrey Repton, as they created picturesque gardens, picturesque landscapes all over Britain in the 18th century. And there's a direct line from Brown and Repton to Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. and his 1857 design for New York's Grand Central Park. So within this broad concept of landscape, or cultural landscape, which the National Park Service adopted, we are concentrating on two subcategories, really. Historic vernacular landscapes and historic designed landscapes. And today I'm going to talk about two particular vernacular landscapes, both of which happen to be in Alachua County. Both are Florida State Historic Parks. And in the entire state of Florida, there are only 46 national historic landmarks. Predictably, several of these are in St. Augustine, our nation's oldest permanent European settlement, with Menendez' arrival in 1565. So again, two of the 46, soon to be 47, are located right here, and we can visit them because they are open to the public. And I think it's important, and it is for me at least, to distinguish between national historic landmarks and properties that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Florida has more than 1,000 properties and districts listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Listing there can be based on local or state significance. And Gainesville itself has 4 National Register Historic Districts, including the historic UF campus, and then 34 buildings listed individually within the city limits. And I'll have to share with you a little story about National Historic Landmarks and UF. I came in 1962, and I often, at that time, the law school was in the location of 13th and University. And I would pass Buckman Hall, and I would be very impressed by this sign that said it was a National Historic Landmark. Well, when I began teaching historic preservation law in 1976 and learned how to look these things up, I discovered it was not a National Historic Landmark at all. Someone at UF had thought it sounded good, and they fabricated a sign, and it was there for years until I finally convinced them to remove it. It is certainly true that it's on the National Register of Historic Places individually and in the campus National Register Historic District. In any event, every other incorporated community in Alachua County, excepting Archer and Hawthorne, has a National Register Historic District. And Archer has an individually listed building, the Bethlehem Presbyterian Church. So what explains the exceptionalism of the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings farm and Dudley Farm. Well, with respect to the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings house and farm, it is clearly the association it has with the Pulitzer Prize winning author of the Yearling, published in 1938. It's equally clear that Rawlings' literary success was grounded in her identification with the pastoral agricultural landscape she became a part of as owner of a productive orange grove, and of the emerging of her own identity with that of her cracker neighbors, both black and white. Now this property, the Rawlings House Farm, was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1970 after architecture students at the University of Florida, under the guidance of Professor Blair Reeves, completed a study of the house and did measured drawings, which were submitted to the Historic American Building Survey collection in the Library of Congress. And here I'm going to take a breath. I originally had this all in one sentence, and I decided it sounded either like Faulkner or James Joyce. So this very tie to a microcosm of Florida farmland, marshland, and hammock that represented the history, culture, and architecture of rural Florida, one that's fast vanishing, proved a major obstacle to recognition of national significance of the author and thus the property. Although the period of significance of the properties, how can I tell what's going on?
You want me to share the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay, gotta do that.
I'm trying to share the PowerPoint here.
I'll do that and then you can click.
Okay. Although the period of significance for the property's eventual National Historic Landmark designation is 1928, the year Marjorie and her husband, first husband, Charles, bought the property, until 1953, the year of her sudden death in St. Augustine's Flagler Hospital. The oldest part of the house was built in the 1880s, and later several additions were made. So Marjorie and Charles bought 74 acres in 1928 from the Armstrong family. At the time, the property included 20 acres of orange grove, actually 3,000 mature orange trees, and they believed that sales from the grove would support their budding writing careers. Well, Charles never fell under the spell of the natural beauty of Cross Creek and their farm, and their floundering marriage ended in 1933, and Charles left Cross Creek in, I believe, the state of Florida. So what we see today in visiting Marjorie's farm looks very much as it did when she died in 1953. And of course, many of you know she left her property to the University of Florida, to what became the University of Florida Foundation. And she left her life estate and her literary estate to her second husband, Norton Baskin, but upon his death, that came to the university as well. And it's very hard to control beyond the grave. And her will makes quite clear that what she wanted to happen with the house was that it be used to house graduate students in the Department of English. And indeed, that happened for a few years before it was closed and basically being permitted to fall down when the university had an enthusiastic young person at the foundation who found the money to fix it up, He even took the furniture up to Rayford, where the prisoners refurbished the furniture, which was original to the house. Well, originally, one would have approached the house, and give you a moment to read this before I pass to the next slide, or the next whatever we call them today.
Slides.
But originally, one would have approached the front door through this metal gate, which is along County Road 325. And for safety's sake, pedestrians now enter from a park next door, which was originally part of her property and now is a county park. So only 45 feet from this gate lies the one-story house and its front porch. Go back to this for a moment. But in front, if you look toward the ground and in front of the lattice work, you will begin to see some of the plantings there. And the first is what many of you are familiar with as Plamosas or Asparagus Fern. And I grew up in the flower business, and this has little thorns on it, and I got many a nick from helping out in the flower shop with arrangements using Plamosas. It later was supplanted by something else from Florida, thank goodness. But in looking up information on these garden, what I call stalwarts of the southern farm setting, I was surprised at the pattern which is going to emerge. This is the pattern that says that none of these things that we take for granted as having been here forever were here at all. They're nearly all exotics. And this asparagus fern, which is in front of the lattice below the front porch, it's not even a fern. It's actually from the lily family, and it's not native to the United States. It's native to South Africa. Then we look at another one of the plantings along the porch, and I'm sorry that it's not in fuller bloom, but you can probably make out the fact that it's Plumbago, which is very, very popular in mid-Florida and certainly in southern Florida. And this is also from South Africa. And in fact, the botanical name is Plumbago capiensis, for the Cape, South Africa. The botanical name Plumbago capiensis, and it's commonly called Cape Plumbago in South Africa, sometimes called leadwort. So again, all these plants that I thought were native and you find so commonly are not native at all. Well, on this front porch, this was her favorite writing spot. And from this vantage point, she looked toward that gate, and the only features that might be considered part of a designed landscape. This is her sundial. The face on it is new. It's a replacement. And the bird bath, both rather crude in terms of the bases, but this is where she sat tight and then occasionally looked up to see her favorite birds, the cardinals, enjoying that bird bath. So this farm truly is a vernacular landscape. It is not designed by a landscape architect. It just sort of happened. Its paths link the various dependencies, and it certainly is an example of form following function. Well, rounding the original 1880s dog trot, that's what this started out as, a dog trot, and we'll see that again in Dudley Farm. But this is a wing of bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, which were added around 1925. They were recycled from a nearby farmstead and moved to the site, attached to the main house by porches and extensions of the original roof. Porches on both the east and west sides of the bedrooms provided shade and protection from rain and allowed windows and doors to remain open for cross ventilation. The outhouse, located northwest of the house and similar to the one described in chapter 6 of her book Cross Creek, was moved to the property after it became a state park. So it is old, but it is not original to the site, but it's on the right spot. And she actually wrote about it often. Well, the first of 2 indoor, back up, the first of 2 indoor bathrooms arrived only with a check for $700 for her sale of Marjorie's short story, Jacob's Ladder. And at the bathroom's christening, she filled the toilet bowl with red roses. And in chapter 6, again, of Cross Creek, it is subtitled The Evolution of Comfort. And she describes the formal opening of the bathroom as a gala social event for Cross Creek. I think it was the first indoor bathroom in Cross Creek. Well, lining the sheltering porch on the west side of the 2 bedrooms, Marjorie grew 2 ornamentals very common to the rural South, and the descendants of those original ones are still here and provide some privacy to the bedrooms if you're standing outside on the west side of the house. The first one is Turks Turbine. I had never heard it called that before, but when I researched it, that's the formal name. And it's called that because it's twisted like a Turk's red cap. Botanically, it is Malvaviscus arboreus, Drummondi, and is, of all things, native to the United States, indeed to the southeast. I'll show you a close-up of it. It extends along the coastal part of the United States as far as Texas. And I had always heard it referred to as either sleeping hibiscus or Scotsman's purse, in both cases because the bloom never opens. But now we know Turks Turbine. Sharing the porch's edge with the sleeping hibiscus or there are 2 or 3 of these large Brugmansias, also called daturas, and better known in North Florida as angel's trumpet, and forbidden from sale from some Florida counties due to its toxic and hallucinogenic quality. As I recall, she never mentions those qualities in any of her writings. But after researching it, it's still unclear to me whether we're looking at Brugmansia suaviola, originating in Brazil, or Brugmansia candida from Ecuador. But I do have a photo that I took on a hiking trip in the Ecuadorian Andes, and this is how large they can grow on their native soil and at that altitude. This one is actually reddish in color and is Brugmansia sanguinea, I think. Well, behind the house lies Marjorie's vegetable garden, fenced against various critters, various invader species. And it's primarily for vegetables. Many of you read her Cross Creek Cookery, I'm sure, and you know that she was a serious cook. Really prepared gourmet meals for her many famous visitors who came to Cross Creek. But it certainly included some flowers that were suitable for cutting for arrangements in the house. And just outside the garden fence grows North Florida's most popular antique rose, the Louis Philippe. And Louis Philippe was a rose stock from China that arrived in France around 1800 and was hybridized by Guérin in France in 1834. So it's our oldest hybridized rose, I think, and I had 5 in my front garden in Gulfview, and I'm sure many of you have them. Well, directly behind or beside the garden, this is a close-up. I'm sorry I was not able to focus better, but that's the Louis Philippe from 1837. Beside the garden and directly behind the kitchen and adjoining dining room, and that was an addition around 1920, long before Marjorie ever got there, lies the duck pen, where the ducks waddle in each evening for protection from the various predators. And Marjorie prized duck eggs above all others for her recipes. And here are the ducks out at noontime. They'll be safely penned by evening. And then there is a path that leads down to the water's edge, down to Orange Lake. Well, as we round the back of the house, we see the house from beginning to end, the house with its various extensions. And although you really can't see it very well here, up the front, there was a porte-cochere added for the Oldsmobile that she drove. The next, as we wander again in a, I guess it would be counterclockwise fashion, we see the pole barn. The pole barn is not original, but it very much reflects the original. It was reconstructed in 1991 based on the original demolished plans that were documented by the historic preservation program at the University of Florida before the demolition. And then opposite the pole barn are some of the chicken coops. And next to them, the bell that was used both for calling people in for meals, but also for raising a fire alarm. Finally, we get to the orange grove itself, which is, again, was originally 20 acres. It's, after a while, she bought additional property on the other side of 325 and expanded the grove there. But after her death, that was allowed to go back to forest, and at some point was bought by the University of Florida Foundation. I'm sorry, was sold by the foundation to the state of Florida to add to the park acreage. So finally, we're in the orange grove, and I took these photographs in late November. So this is this year's crop, and they look great. And this is what brought Marjorie and Charles here in 1928. And our visit ends at the orange grove's western edge at this tenant house. The tenant house housed 2 black families. And note the, what I call, swept yard surrounding the house. This was a prominent feature of the vernacular landscape, not just here, but through the South generally. And it was said to serve 2 purposes. One, to prevent fire, which was always a threat to these frame buildings. But the other was to, it had to be swept every day, but you could look and see whether a snake had slivered across the sand or not. So these were the 2 primary purposes of the swept yard. Like the barn, the original tenant house was demolished in 1969, but this replacement was moved across County Road 325 from Cape Barnes National Register listed historic house. It was done in 2002 with a committee and a lot of research to permit a more complete interpretation of life on Marjorie's farm. For those of you who've read Cross Creek in particular, you have read about the tenants who inhabited the original tenant house. And interestingly, it's offset just a bit from the foundations of the original tenant house, which is an archaeological technique, which is quite common, so that archaeological excavations could be done on the precise site at some future time. So earlier I mentioned that Marjorie's literary tie to this small part of rural North Florida would become an obstacle in raising the level of recognition of her farm's significance from its 1970 National Register listing to the ranks of a National Historic Landmark. Well, the inspiration for seeking National Historic Landmark designation came as the result of a 2004 visit to the farm by the then chief of the National Historic Landmark Survey and keeper of the National Register of Historic Places. During the visit, she remarked, "This should be a National Historic Landmark." So with that encouragement, the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings Society commissioned our area's leading expert on preparing such documents, Murray Laurie, to draft a National Historic Landmark nomination, one which I think is brilliant. Well, upon receipt in Washington, the very same administrator and bureaucrat who had inspired the nomination with her enthusiastic, "This ought to be a National Historic Landmark," wrote back, quote, "Given her regional literary reputation, accomplished in portraying the cracker culture of Northern Florida, demonstrating national significance might prove difficult." And then she bolstered this by quoting an outdated Dictionary of American Biography, which said, "Rawlings is not likely to go down in literary history either as a major American writer or a major writer of the Depression era," unquote. Well, in addition to that, an administrator in the National Park Service Atlanta Regional Office piled on by saying, quote, "Nobody asked me, but Rawlings was a flash in the pan with only one successful book." So you can understand that both Ms. Laurie and the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings Society were deflated. But history has its surprises. And after President George W. Bush brought Florida Park Service Director Fran Manella to Washington as director of the National Park Service, a new chief of the National Historic Landmark Survey and keeper of the National Register was appointed. And our enemy in the Atlanta regional office opted for early retirement and moved to the south of France. So with a level playing field, Ms. Laurie's nomination was circulated to the National Historic Landmarks Committee for review. And at the Landmarks Committee's meeting in Washington, after an eloquent presentation by Ms. Laurie, the committee voted unanimously and enthusiastically for designation. And of course, I sat quietly in a corner. I had to recuse myself from voting as I had a conflict of interest as a past president of the Rawlings Society. But Rawlings Farm was formally added to the list of National Historic Landmarks on September the 20th, 2006, 36 years after its addition to the National Register of Historic Places. So we now move to another part of the county. At least I think I am. Yes, to Dudley Farm. And I know many of you have been there. Many Ocomic residents have been there. It's located west of Gainesville on Highway 26, barely within the very expanded city limits of Newberry. The National Historic Landmarks Committee voted unanimously on November the 5th, 2020, 2 days after the national election, to recommend to the National Park System Advisory Board that Dudley Farm become the 47th National Historic Landmark located in the state of Florida. We expect that formal designation as early as the end of this month. It's a pro forma action, but it has to be done. So, like the Rawlings Farm, Dudley was earlier listed on the National Register of Historic Places, in its case on October the 4th, 2002, and at the levels of both state and local significance. And I know that many residents of Ocomic have visited Dudley Farm, and I assume that many other participants in this program have as well. And you may well be asking yourself, what could possibly elevate this Alachua County farm to the rarefied company of the Castillo in St. Augustine or Flagler's magnificent Hotel Ponce de Leon, two of Florida's present 46 National Historic Landmarks? Well, I had the same question when I first heard the director of the Getty Foundation's Grants Division had remarked during a 2004 visit to Dudley, this ought to be a National Historic Landmark. Does that sound familiar? Well, I was stunned. Clearly, this was a case of not seeing the forest for the trees. At the time, I was near the end of an 8-year term on the National Historic Landmarks Committee. In addition, at the request of the Florida State Park Service, I'd been actively involved at Dudley Farm since Myrtle Dudley, fulfilling her mother's wish that the farm be preserved, conveyed title to the farm to the people of Florida in 1983. And I loved the farm and Miss Myrtle, but I thought national significance was a real stretch. So I decided to seek a second expert opinion. Fortuitously, Patricia O'Donnell, the principal partner of one of our nation's leading cultural resource firms, Heritage Landscapes, headquartered in Vermont, was soon to visit UF's landscape architecture program to give a lecture. So I borrowed her for a morning, fortified her with a real breakfast at Newberry's Country Kitchen, and then took her to Dudley Farm. Her verdict, Dudley Farm ought to be a National Historic Landmark. No longer a doubter, I arranged a 2-day site visit to the farm by Dr. Alexandra Lord, who was at that point branch chief of the National Park Service National Historic Landmark Program, and Linda McClellan, the National Park Service expert on historic landscapes. Well, the farm staff, here's your first view of the principal building itself. Well, the staff at the farm went all out to court the visiting dignitaries from Washington. And here in the original kitchen, one of the staff is preparing lunch for the visitors, and they served lunch to us here in the adjoining dining room. You know, as you're not surprised, even if you haven't been there, the kitchen was separate from the house for fire and heat reasons, and graced the table with wonderful flowers from the garden itself. So after the visit from Dr. Lord and her assistant, Linda McClellan, here's what she wrote back. We believe this property represents a rare and possibly unique, intact example of the small-scale diversified farm, a property type that once characterized much of the southeastern United States. Too often, agricultural museums and parks are artificial assemblages of buildings and structures moved from other locations. And in the trade, we refer to them as petting zoos for buildings. They lack the cohesiveness and authenticity of place as an accurate representation of rural life and small-scale agricultural diversification. Dudley Farm, on the other hand, stands out for its representation of an actual farm and the wealth of the material culture historically associated with agricultural and domestic activities. This material culture exists in the form of farm buildings, fences, fields, orchards, arbors, vegetation, and archaeological sites, as well as the collection of family records, household objects, and agricultural implements. It is these qualities that enable the property to rise to the national level of significance and merit consideration as a National Historic Landmark. So remember that in case anyone ever asks you, why on earth is this a National Historic Landmark? Well, with this letter in hand, the Friends of Dudley Farm engaged Murray Laurie, who had earlier written the nomination for the Rawlings house, to write the National Historic Landmark nomination for Dudley Farm. And success finally came 13 years after that original Getty Foundation representative commented that this ought to be a National Historic Landmark. And again, with a unanimous and very enthusiastic vote for the designation. So what are the beginnings of Dudley Farm? Well, like other prominent settlers of Alachua County, notably the Hales, the Chestnuts, and the Mathesons, Philip Benjamin Harvey Dudley, who was born in 1814, left South Carolina in the 1850s, and by 1855 purchased a 160-acre homestead that is part of today's Dudley Farm. By 1859, the homestead property had encompassed some 500 acres as he bought adjoining parcels. And the limestone foundation of the Dudley family, it was a dog trot style home from 1859. Those foundations are hidden in the woods on the northwest edge of the original farm. There is evidence of a well there, but nothing else that can be seen of the original family home. But shortly before P.B.H. Dudley, as he was referred to, died in 1881, he transferred 280 acres of his 500-acre tract to his only living son, Ben, who was born in 1852. And he was by now married to Fanny Wynn, who was born in 1858 in the same general area. Well, the senior Dudley, P.B.H., died shortly after he transferred the property. But in 1882, around the time their third child had been born, Ben and Fanny constructed a new one-story dog trot dwelling that forms the core. I need to go, how do I get back to that?
He is back.
They had constructed this, originally it was a one-story dog trot. In other words, it's completely open from front to back. It's hard to see because of the shadow now, but it was closed in quite a long time ago. So again, they built the dog trot, and that's the core of the present building. Now, Fanny bore 9 children, all of whom survived to adulthood. In addition, her 7 younger siblings came to live at Dudley after the death of her parents in 1881 and 1882. So 16 children required a little expansion. And to accommodate this growing family, the Dudleys first enclosed the dog trot center passage and later added an upper half story, which served as the girls' dormitory. All the boys lived in a room on the back on the left, so that was the boys' dormitory. The parents lived right across the hall, the dog trot, because they wanted to be able to check on the boys. They felt the girls were safer upstairs, and perhaps they were. Well, part of the magic of a visit to Dudley Farm is the walk from today's visitor center to the house and its many dependencies. Very quickly, one leaves the 21st century and is transported to the rural North Florida landscape of the 1880s as you walk along the unpaved road that as early as 1870 connected Newberry with Gainesville. This road became a private farm road in the late 1910s after the early 1920s, following construction of State Route 26, which was, I guess, about a half a mile to the south. We passed the cracker cattle there. I think you can see them in the pasture. And then we reached something that was very important, because this is what made cattle industry thrive in Florida. This is a cattle dipping vat. The cattle go down into that hole, really, through a liquid bath of creosote. It's a creosote solution that killed cattle ticks. This was actually the invention of the pharmacist in nearby Newberry, Dr. Berry. And again, extremely important in the history of agriculture in Florida. So this is the original cattle dipping vat. Then next to it, you reach the tobacco barn, which was constructed about 1930. And when I first came to Florida in 1962 and took back roads to and from Tallahassee, I saw lots of these tobacco barns. There are very, very few left. So this is, again, an important part of the overall complex and the dependencies. Well, before reaching the old Jonesville Road, which actually dates from the late 1850s, we passed the barn and then the site of their general store, which operated from the late 1880s until 1915. And for a period, it served as the U.S. Post Office, and they called the community Dudley. So you could actually mail a letter to Dudley and it would be picked up there in a building next to the tobacco barn. And I will show you that building later because it was moved in 1915 to another part of the property and recycled. I mean, these people were the epitome of sustainability. They never threw anything away. They reused everything. Well, upon reaching that point, the intersection of the old Jonesville Road and the road from Newberry to Gainesville, we get this view from the front gate. Now, just this side of the gate was the original road from Newberry to Gainesville. And I don't have a photograph of it, but behind us is a sinkhole, which at the moment is dry. But during Miss Myrtle's lifetime, it was full of water, and the cattle driven along that old road to the railroad in Gainesville for transport would stop for a drink in that sinkhole, which she watched from the front porch. Well, upon this main pathway looking directly toward the house from the garden gate is aligned with the central north-south hall of the house, originally, again, an open dog trot. Now, you may wonder about architectural style, and you may be surprised, maybe not, to know that architectural historians describe Dudley Farm, the main house, as being Georgian in style. Well, when I think of Georgian, I think of Westover on the north bank of the James River, the seat of the Byrd family. And this is considered probably the finest entry in America. It's often published in books. But it is, if you really think about it and look at it carefully, it is symmetrical in every way. That's the hallmark of the Georgian style. It's a very formal layout. The two rooms on either side of the dog trot are the same size. All four of the downstairs rooms are the same size. And then if you look at it, I think I'm going to show you from the side, you see it's symmetrical as well. So don't call this cracker, call it Georgian. Maybe you can call it Georgian cracker, but it's not an unsophisticated design. But going back to the design of the garden, and again thinking of it from the gate, the order of the garden, let me back up to it. The order of the garden is directly related to the house's hallway, whose north-south axis extends south from the porch, dividing the garden into four parts of the house as the house is divided. And the width of the garden mirrors the length of the house and side yards, while its depth reflects a proportion 1.5 times the house height. So the garden becomes the invitation to the porch and its center steps, and thus to the home and to the family. So this geometric elegance may be vernacular, but it is not without design itself. The garden's original creator, Fanny, imbued the three daughters, two who never married, one who was divorced, which had to have been unusual for that day and time, came back to live there, and a son who never married. The four of them lived there with her until her death in 1937 or 8. And the last of the children to die was Miss Myrtle, who gave the property to the people of Florida. But the garden's full of interesting plants as well as interesting garden objects. And I think that there are 28 different varieties of roses have been identified in their garden. Fanny specialized in roses, and the garden was particularly strong in terms of roses and bulbs. And one of the bulbs that has naturalized there, this is actually taken at the Philadelphia Flower Show just before the lockdown in late February. I was there. But these naturalized just to the right of the house as you're facing it. And I actually had these in my garden in Gulfview from Dudley Farm. And I know Walter Wynn is now growing them here at Okama and sharing bulbs if any of you want one. In any event, they were very strong on roses and on bulbs. Again, many varieties of heirloom roses. And the other thing that happened in the 1930s, perhaps to add a little money in during the Depression, the sisters got very heavily into hybridizing amaryllis. And they were very competitive. They each had a quadrant of the garden, and they sort of competed against each other. This is a photo I made in 1998 in the spring. And on the far left, just in front of the house, you can see, and behind an ancient sago, you can see Florida's state champion red Buckeye. It's one of my most cherished memories is rocking on the porch as Miss Myrtle was shelling peas and reminiscing about the cattle drovers coming along the old road in front, and then heading on for Gainesville and the railroad depot. And in the meantime, in that red Buckeye, there's a battalion of ruby-throated hummingbirds attacking the blossoms of the red Buckeye. Well, the garden has unique ornaments, vernacular at its best, and they are shown as, and they're dated to 1930. And my favorites are the two bird baths. The first one with a rough concrete finish with concrete pieces resembling petals hanging down from the circular bath. This is really latter-day Art Nouveau design. In the second one, you can see that the upper section of the base is a concrete cast from a large tin food can. And then in the top is a shallow metal bowl. And I can't think of a precedent for this outburst of creativity. I mean, these women had a wonderful time in their garden. And I can't leave the garden without showing you the flower pit. This is dated from 1920, and this is south facing. It's mortared limestone, and it sheltered the porch plants in winter. And you saw the, I'll back up porch plants. And you see the porch plants there now. Well, they were there originally. And Fanny didn't start the formal garden until after they stopped tethering the horses to that railing that now has the plants. So it was at that point, sometime in the early teens or 20s, that she started the garden. Okay. Well, of all the dependencies, this is the favorite of nearly every visitor. It's a three-holer. This is the men's outhouse from about 1900. And the women's outhouse had disappeared before Miss Myrtle gave the property to the state. but she remembers it as being very similar to the men's outhouse. And you note the very neat smaller one for the male children in the family. Well, I want to show you what was going on at Westover at that time in terms of outhouses. As a contrast, even had a fireplace in it. But we were much simpler people, and of course it was a lot warmer in Florida, so perhaps they didn't need that. Now, in the time remaining, very few minutes, I want to quickly show photos of other dependencies as backdrops to Dudley Farm activities, which I have photographed over many years. This is in 2001, and this is the formal opening of the park, the ribbon cutting. It had been open to visitors for several years before because, again, Miss Myrtle continued to live there until her death at age 94 in 1996. Then we had a very successful paint out there in 2009. This is Alistair Richardson, who's a well-known Tallahassee artist, looking at the 1890 cane mill. And then many of you will recognize Kate Barnes, our former county commissioner, and the artist who painted several of the paintings in our two dining rooms. And on that same day, I took this picture of Sally Morrison, who was critical to the success of both Rawlings and then later Dudley. And she in turn grew up at Bok Tower Gardens, which we will be talking about during the last session. Her father was the longtime director there. And so Sally grew up loving plants and being interested in landscape. This is at one of our cane days, and I just thought it was delightful with the children playing with the pump in the foreground, the fiddlers in the background. Here we have the combination of wash house and dairy, where milk was kept cool by having insulated walls and places for storing jams and what have you. And then here, children learning what life was like when we had no washing machines. Here is a child meeting our favorite turkey, Dudley. And here, this is a casing around the original well from the 1890s. For safety reasons, we've encased it, but move the top and you can look down and see. Now, here's Sally Morrison again. This is at a different event, but I have it in here because behind her is that original general store that was moved to this location in 1915, and that addition on the left was added to it as a garage when when Ben bought his first Ford automobile. So again, they recycled everything. And finally, we come to cane day. And here are children feeding cane into the mill, and old Ned trudging around and grinding the cane. And my last photograph is so special. Many of you remember Sarah Matheson. Well, that's Sarah on the left and Myrtle on the right. And this was the occasion of cane grind. And the inspiration for the cane grind, which has been held now for more than 20 years, came from Miss Myrtle's request when she was still living there, and we asked her how she would like to celebrate her birthday, which was in early December. And she said, well, let me think on it. And she thought on it, And then a day or two later, she said, I think I'd like to have a cane grind. So on the first Saturday of December, the Saturday nearest her birthday, we had the first cane grind. And then the year that Sarah and Miss Myrtle were each 90 years old, and each having given their homes for the public for entertainment and education, they had never met each other. So I invited Sarah to go with me to the cane grind. And they're sitting there on a bench in front of the bubbling cauldron where the cane juice is being cooked down, holding hands. And I think that's a great note on which to end this lecture. So thank you for being here. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them.
Roy Wilson Bell, am I coming through okay?
Yes, go ahead.
First, let me say I'm delighted that you covered the 2009 paint out in plein air at the Dudley Farm. I was also one of the artists there that day, and I loved the view from the front garden, and also saw that same symmetry that you did, except I flipped my painting through the gate as if guests would be coming up to the farm. And I'm glad to share that was one of the first major paintings that I sold. So, and my first open show, my painting.
It was a perfect day. It was a perfect day, and I think it was a huge success.
I also wanted to comment, I would echo what you concluded. My initial visit to Dudley Farm was like, well, ho hum, this looks just like my grandpa's farm, who was actually next door to the Dudley Farm, with the same doghouse and all the other elements there. But then I went back with my granddaughter and toured her with Dudley Farm and came to the same conclusion. It is an incredible compilation of all those elements of our southern, vernacular farm, with the cane grinding, which we still have on our property, the tobacco barns. And as an expert in tobacco curing and cooking, I was also impressed by the authenticity at the tobacco barn. They actually had a tobacco sled in which we gathered it out of the field and brought it to the barn. Usually they don't include that detail, but I thought that was quite convincing.
Well, thank you. Any other questions?
What type of oranges did Rawlings grow, and where did she sell them?
They were exported. I guess they were taken over to Orange. What's the little town just?
McIntosh.
Orange Park?
No.
Or McIntosh.
Orange
or McIntosh.
No, they weren't taken to McIntosh. They were taken over to the little town. Island Grove. Island Grove. I think they were taken to Island Grove because the railroad ran by there. And of course, I don't know whether you've ever been there or not, but if you've never been, you really need to go to the cemetery where she was buried. You go through Island Grove to get there. And it's like her wishes not being honored in terms of what happened to the house. She had been to the funeral of a friend who had died from drinking poison, thinking it was water. And the little cemetery where he was buried, she thought was so beautiful that she said to Norton, when I die, that's where I want to be buried. Well, when they were on the way to the cemetery, and Norton realized they were going to the wrong cemetery, but he decided he couldn't do anything about it at that point. So she got buried a few feet from her arch enemy who had sued her for invasion of privacy. So again, it's very hard to plan these things with any certainty. But the oranges that were taken to Island Grove, I think, and the train stopped there for them. It's just north of Citro and the orange shop.
Richard, do you have a comment, question?
No, no, thank you.
Okay.
I guess a question came up. You said that there were plans of the house pole barn before they replaced it, And are there archives or of historical plans at the University of Florida in the architecture department of many historical houses that were in this region, or is there a treasure trove of architectural drawings of original buildings that were major architectural events in North
Yes.
Carolina?
Yes. I'm not sure about the barn. I feel confident it was surveyed, but I'm not positive. I'm positive about the house. Thanks to Blair Reeves, who created the Historic Preservation Program in the School of Architecture here in the late 40s, early 50s. His students did measured drawings of the quality required by the Historic American Building Survey of so many of the buildings in the countryside around Gainesville. And I know that the Habs drawings of the Rawlings house itself are in Washington. This is all part of the Library of Congress. So thanks to Blair and that program at the architecture school, an incredible number of buildings around here, including farms, and one of the best ones, which is not in our county, but it's now in a petting zoo in McClenny, but it's called the Burnside Blockhouse, B-U-R-N-S-E-D, which has gun ports in it. It's really remarkable. And I was in it with Blair and his students on its original location before it got moved into McClenny to the petting zoo. But yes, that barn probably was documented, but I have not seen the document.
I think in your discussion, you suggested there were plans of the pole house before it was demolished to replace it.
Yeah.
In your lecture.
Well, I thought I was talking about the house. I was talking about the house primarily, but I think that the pole barn would have been documented. I can't imagine they would have demolished it without doing that.
What was the purpose of a pole barn? Just to...
Well, I remember early on in my career at Florida and being on a board at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and they kept talking about the pole barn and what was stored at the pole barn. And I what is a pole barn? Well, it just refers to the fact that they put poles in the ground and then built around them. So there were no, concrete foundations or anything like that. So they were just very utilitarian form of a barn.
Thank you.
Well, next week I will talk about Florida's historic designed landscapes. I will talk about 3 that were designed in the late 19th century. And then the following week, we are in for a real treat when Richard Farwell talks to us about Vizcaya and the other mansions of the 1920s in Miami. So again, look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you for joining us. Have a good day, everyone.